I would like to officially welcome everybody to the Manitowish Waters Historical Society Zoom presentation by Kay Krans. I'm Jim Boker, and I'll be your moderator. And Kay is going to be talking about Francis Badger, muralist and artist. This is one of three Zoom presentations that we will do.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm really excited about talking about Francis Badger. I've only known her for a few years, and I found her in the deepest, darkest part of a night. I couldn't sleep. We were looking for information on Rice Creek off of Big Lake because we've done some, well, Jim, you've done some management with getting it on the National Register of Historic Places where the old Ojibwe camps were. But anyways, I found a picture of Ojibwe people gathering rice, and the artist was Francis Badger. So after a long journey of studying about her, we had a connection. The original paintings that I found two actually, which you'll see later on. We now have prints of those at the Frank B. Kohler Library for everyone to see. They're really stunning pictures, and Susan Miller Crane of Moon Deer framed them in her handmade birch bark frames, so they really look awesome. But anyways, back to the story. So in order to find out more about the paintings, I called the St. Charles Public Library in St. Charles, Illinois. And in contact with the head librarian, I said, you know, you have two pictures that are really important to the northern part of Wisconsin, Vilas County to be exact. Would you ever be willing to sell those paintings to the Manitowish Waters Historical Society? And she said, you know, I think there's one back in our copy room, and I think the other one's in storage. But she said, let me check on that. She said, I think we probably could sell those. And I was all excited. But of course, then we have to worry about what the price is going to be and how we're going to get them up here. And I waited for her to call me back for about a month, and then we made contact again, and she said, well, Kay, I'm really sorry. We talked to the board, and at first they were excited about selling these paintings to you, but then the art curator for the St. Charles Public Library looked at them and said, I don't think they should ever leave Illinois. Francis Badger was a very prominent Chicago, Illinois painter, and they need to stay at home. But she said, we will send the originals to Chicago and have cliché prints made at a prominent printmakers. So they had beautiful prints made. As a matter of fact, the prints are so vibrant, it's hard to tell they're not the originals. And they sent them up to Frank B. Kohler Memorial Library. Well, in return, I put together a PowerPoint, and Janelle Cole, the librarian at the library, and Beth Dahlmeyer, the president of the Friends of the Library, and myself went down to St. Charles and looked at their library and met people and gave a talk there and had a really good time. And we realized that that library has an incredible collection of artworks. So that's how I got started with Francis Badger. Next. Here's a picture of the St. Charles Library, a little bigger than the Frank B. Kohler Library. And they have their original Carnegie Library within the structure of all this large library that's been added on to many times. Okay, next. Here's a picture of Francis Badger in her middle age. But let's sit back and think about Francis Badger as a young girl. Next. Well, if you look at this and read this direct quote from Francis, you'll find out that when she was 4 years old, she first set foot in northern Wisconsin. 4 years old, 1908. Now think about 1908. Now her father was a very prominent lumber broker in Chicago. He had holdings in Wisconsin and he had holdings in the Northwest. He bought a piece of property from a guy named Laughlin that had never been cut. The rest of Big Lake had already been cut, but his property was intact. I think it was over 80 acres that he purchased, and it had 12 cabins. And she became mesmerized by nature. Next. Here's a picture of the chain of lakes in Manitowish waters. And if you look in the top right-hand corner, you will see Big Lake. Now, the Big Lake is actually attached to Island Lake. So it really is kind of part of the chain. If you were in a canoe, this would be part of the Manitowish chain. So when Francis first came up here, there were no roads out to the lakes. So what they had to do is get on the train in Chicago around 5 o'clock at night. Sarah Cowles Badger, her mother, would pack a picnic lunch for the family. There were 2 boys and a girl, and Adelphus Shreve Badger and his wife, Sarah. They took the train all the way to what Francis always called a whistle stop, and that was Manitowish. When they got to Manitowish in the early morning, oh, by the way, on the way, Mother always made these awesome picnic lunches and always made sure her husband had a cold beer in the basket. Well, she also had one for herself. And when they got early morning to Manitowish, they had breakfast at Lee Doriot's place. And Lee and his wife made wonderful pancakes, and little Francis was so excited about that. After breakfast and resting a short time, they got on a buckboard with all their possessions and commodities that they were bringing up to the estate. And then they started traveling along the Manitowish River. And as Francis referred to the location, on their way to the dam, which is our Rest Lake Dam today. Next. Once they got to the dam, a boat would meet them, and the boat was quite a nice little steamboat that took them through the chain to Clear Lake. Now on Clear Lake, they had to get out of that boat and then had to portage 2 miles to their spot on Big Lake, where they were going to go and meet rowboats on Big Lake to row. Well, they weren't rowing, they had people rowing for them to their place 2 miles across Big Lake. This is a picture of the Tamaracks, as it was called when they purchased it. Now, Francis talked about 12 cottages, 12 log cottages. And I think it's really cool. These early estates were, and resorts, the buildings were sleeping cabins, dining cabins, kitchen cabins, recreation cabin, if you want to have it that way, with maybe a pool table in it. But she said they were built in 2 styles. She said the majority of the cabins were of the English style. They were horizontal log cabins, and the bark was peeled off the logs. But there was several of the French style, which is vertical log cabins with the bark still on the cabin. They had a little cat, and she always loved to watch the cat on those vertical log cabins, because that cat loved scratching that tamarack bark. Okay, next. Now, she talks a lot as a young girl about a pavilion that was built out on the water. She said it was such a great place because you didn't have to work hard at swimming and still be on top of the water all day. She loved to take books out there and read and listen to the slapping waves coming up against the pilings. That pavilion was full of treasures, as was the whole estate. Now, Mr. Laughlin, who owned the estate before them, had traveled the world and collected artifacts from anywhere from Egypt to Ireland. And when he sold the estate to Adelphus Shreve Badger, everything was with it. So she would just love looking over all those artifacts. And even in the pavilion, her parents had placed a chair that was really special to them that they had bought on a European tour. This chair was from Holland. Next. Oh, so he's a Adelphus Shreve Badger. I always want to call him Adelphius. I don't know why, but he's Alpheus. He's a wealthy lumberman, and he's a second-generation Chicagoan. Now, listen to this story about his father. His father was Leonidas Badger, and Leonidas was from New Hampshire. His family had come over from England and settled in New Hampshire. And as a young man, he wanted excitement and adventure, and he traveled west. But in the meantime, he met up with a girl named Sarah Cowles. Adelphus's wife was Sarah Cowles. Leonidas' wife was a Sheridan, and she was from Charleston, South Carolina. So Leonidas and his wife traveled as far as Louisville, Kentucky, where he became a very successful banker. Now, the Civil War breaks out, and he is a Yankee, and he doesn't believe in the war. So he decides to move his family and his slaves, because his wife was a South Carolinian, she owned slaves. They moved to Chicago in 1861. So now we've got a Southern family with 4 or 5 slaves who are living in Chicago. The family immediately frees the slaves and sets them up with jobs and homes on the west side of Chicago. As a matter of fact, Abraham Lincoln is connected with Badger because he's a banker and he knows Southern bankers. And Lincoln thinks that when the war is over, that Mr. Badger potentially could help the economics of the post-war through that knowledge with Southern bankers and Northern bankers getting together. There was also a thought that Lincoln was thinking of a plan to pay Southerners for the freed slaves. Anyways, this letter was written from Lincoln acknowledging that Badger would be a wonderful person to work with, other bankers to work with, but he wanted him to move to New York. And he said, no, I can't move to New York. I'm going to keep my family here in Chicago. Anyways, what I find interesting is that letter from Lincoln is passed down through the family, passed to Alpheus, and then on to Alpheus's son, Shreve Badger. Shreve Badger loans it to Yale University. And Francis Badger, our artist, which you haven't learned a lot about yet, is so upset because Yale is storing this letter that was so prominent in their family's homes for generations in the basement of an archive. So she goes to Yale, demands the letter back, and gives it to the Illinois Historical Society to keep in the Midwest, she said, where it should have been kept all along. Next. Here's a picture up north, and you see little Frances Badger with her father. And by this time, she's an acclaimed artist. So at the age of 3, now her father was a great storyteller, and he would put Frances and the 2 boys on his lap and tell them all kinds of stories about the white grandfather mouse and his 150 grandchildren. And one time, Frances listened to that story, and she came back with a very elaborate picture that she had drawn at the age of 3. And her father was so impressed, he went out and bought her an easel. And Frances said, from that day on, my career was set. Next. Here's the beautiful Sarah Cowles badger, and Sarah is from California. Now, Sarah's family is as wealthy and prominent in San Francisco as the Badger family is in Chicago. She moves to the Midwest and becomes a very important person in helping Frances become an artist and encouraging her work. And she's a progressive woman in her own right, because she begins to think about this beautiful estate they go to every summer. And she says, why shouldn't we just open this as a camp in the summer? So Frances has girls to play with, and girls get the exposure to what it's like to live in the wilds of northern Wisconsin. So by 1917, she begins bringing 50 girls every summer to Big Lake from the end of June to the beginning of September. Next. This is just a collaboration in a newspaper article showing that there really was a Badger camp for girls, and Mr. Badger came to visit. Next slide. Here's a picture of the beautiful pavilion, but you notice it's not called the Tamaracks anymore, because Mrs. Badger thought the Tamaracks was not a sufficient name because there were only 2 scrawny tamaracks on the property. But she knew that Big Lake was one of the most famous fishing lakes at the turn of the century in Vilas County. So she used the Ojibwa word for fish and changed the name of the estate to Keego Lodge. Here again is a picture of Frances as a small child. Now, when the family would come, Frances would stay in cabin number 2 with her mom and dad, because there were 2 bedrooms in that cabin. But the little cabin down by the lake, just off on Rice Creek, was her playhouse, soon to be called her artist studio. Next. Now, again, I was talking about the drowsy slapping of the water and the enjoyable days on the water in the pavilion. Can you imagine that beautiful kind of round-shaped pavilion with screens on it and just laying on a chaise lounge reading a good book? Next. Here she's talking about the logs and the different styles. I never knew there was an English style and a French style up north, but there certainly were. Next. Here's a picture of one of the early vertical style log cabins on the property. Next. And here she talks about traveling by road to get to the dam, and just talking about why is Big Lake called Big Lake, and how is it different than any other big lake in northern Wisconsin? It had Rice Creek. Next. This is a modern day photograph taken by Emily Bokern, actually, of Rice Creek. Next. Another photograph. You can see how intense the plant material is in the creek. And you can imagine Frances sitting down either in her little artist studio or down on the banks by the water, and just really focusing on all the textures, the color, and the differences in shapes to learn to be a great artist. Next. Now we come to this part where we're talking about the history of this area. It's so important to the Ojibwa, this Rice Creek. There was fall camping where families would come, mark their territories for collecting their rice, process their rice, and enjoy get-togethers with groups of people. It was a really important time culturally and for food gathering purposes. And this became the subject of 2 of her famous paintings. Next. just another picture of how beautiful the lake was in her eyes and what she might have seen. Next. So Frances Badger stated, and we haven't been able to decide that that's absolutely the truth, but she believed that and was told that Rice Creek was the second largest rice bed in the state, and that the Lac du Flambeau Chippewa use this each August to harvest their wild rice. There actually was an Ojibwa man by the name of Ake Wens who lived out on Rice Creek to protect and take care of the rice beds year round. Next. Here's a picture of the point where Keego Lodge or the Tamaracks is located. And you notice there's a deep bay, and then the arrow points right out how far it protrudes out onto the lake. And then the inlet into Rice Creek. Now you see two lakes here. One is on the right is called Keego, and one on the left, we believe, today it has a different name, but we believe this may have been the Bass Lake that Frances Badger painted as an adult. Next slide. Here is the remnants of an Ojibwa rice camp. You can see the poles that are set for putting up tents and just the infrastructure that's left every year before they come back and gather again. Next slide. Another picture of Ojibwa camp. We were really fortunate to get those two pictures from the Keith family, who also live on the island on Big Lake. Next slide. Here is the first picture that I found in the middle of the night searching. And what do you think about? I just love the color. She was known to use color and use color in a modernist way. Now, when she was growing up, as soon as she got old enough, she went to a junior school of the Art Institute of Chicago. And at that junior school, she met some really famous artists from Chicago as a young girl. And then she went to a famous private school called Roycemore in Evanston, Illinois, and later did her college work at the Art Institute of Chicago. In 1927, she takes a European tour with one of her artist teacher's daughters, and they travel Europe studying art. But here you see this beautiful, it is a precursor for a mural that she hoped to paint later on. I love the lines. I love the birch bark canoes are so incredible. And you see the brown, it almost looks like a curlicue sticking out of the water. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 of those. That's the way that the Ojibwe would bundle rice and tie it off for it to continue to ripen so that the birds wouldn't get at the seed. Next slide. This is her second picture that we found of Big Lake Rice Creek. And here you see the family cooking, and you see them pulling out a big sack of wild rice out of the canoe on the right. You see the children and the dogs playing, and you see a paddle in the Ojibwe man's hand on the left side of the picture, and he's going to be ready to get the rice to parch, which you stir over an open fire until it begins to almost pop like popcorn. Next picture. Now here is a painting from her memory of Bass Lake. Now, all through her career, art is just integral in her work. And she often stated that it was because of her exposure to nature in northern Wisconsin that she painted the subject she did. And here you can see native plants. You can see water lilies, you can see pink lady slippers, you can see a heron in the background. I love that watercolor. Next. Here's another one. It was never titled, but we assume we're up north again in her memory, or actually there. You see pickerel weed, arrowroot, you see again the lady slippers, and now you see the pine. Yeah, beautiful floral picture. Next slide. This is a quote from the Chicago Tribune, that again, that wild nature is what influenced her so much. Next slide. So let's talk about her as an art student, as a professional artist, and as a teacher. She never stopped her connection with the Art Institute of Chicago. So as a young girl, she goes to the young school for children at the Art Institute. She goes to college at the Art Institute, and she becomes a teacher at the Art Institute of Chicago. Also, she taught in the summer at several different places, which we'll talk about. When she graduates, she becomes really involved in what was called the Tree Studio in Chicago. Very prominent artists painted at that location. And as the Great Depression hit in 1929, Alpheus Shreve Badger and his family were very affected and lost their fortune. So now here's a family of tremendous prominence. They continue through the next generations to be very prosperous, but during the Depression, they had to totally rebuild. Okay, next slide. This is a 1948 picture of her from the Chicago Tribune. You know, it's really strange. I can't find out all this stuff, but I found a picture of her in about 1925 getting married to somebody named Reichman. But there, after the marriage announcement, I can find absolutely nothing about that marriage. And then in, I believe it was 1940 it was, she married Paul Schofield, had one child, but again, very little mention of Paul. You learn a lot about her son, but you never hear about the husbands, and she never changes her name. She was referred to in the newspaper articles as Mrs. Frances Badger. Next. Well, here's a picture of the Art Institute of Chicago, a wonderful place to learn about art. Next slide. So the Depression hits, the family doesn't have much money. She gets involved with the Federal Arts Project through the Illinois Arts Project, part of the wing of the Works Progress Administration under Roosevelt. And she was assigned in 1935 as a muralist. Now, she had worked with a very famous muralist in her undergraduate work, so this wasn't new to her. Next. Things go south in 1938. There's kind of, well, there's sexism at the time in our country and all over the world, but there are a lot of male artists in mural work, and they don't like women working with them. And she is forced out. By 1938, she's forced out of the program. But she continued to paint until 1994. But she never painted with the zeal and the excitement that she did during those mural days when she was painting for the federal government. Next. Now, look at how different this painting is compared to the Wild Rice mural paintings. Again, though, what's the topic of her work? the woods in French, the woods and the plains. But look at the movement in that painting. And again, the color. Next. Again, she's experimenting with modernism, and look what's coming out of the mountains. They come alive. Next. So here's just a piece of dying dead wood in the forest, and just look how I don't know, I gouache painting, look at the colors again, and I love that, the texture of the wood. Next. I was looking on eBay one day and I put Francis Badger in, and this woodcut was for sale. I wish I had purchased it, but I just was afraid it would go up too high. But again, topic is nature, the bobolink. So she got into woodblock art printing and watercolor, oil. She used lots of different mediums and was really good at anything she attempted. Next. Where did she acquire that gift of art? She was influenced by her early life and the attention to the forest in northern Wisconsin. I love this quote. Take a minute to read it. Next. Now we go to some famous murals. I wanted to ask if anybody's ever seen these murals. These are at the Oak Park Historical Society now, but they were this was a piece of a mural at the Louis Stevenson Playground in Oak Park, Illinois. And the theme was Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. Again, the people are so involved in discussions, and things are happening, and we can tell by this mural just exactly what the history of this book is. Next. Here's another scene. We even have a skeleton in the small right-hand corner, and we've got a sword fight going on the left. But very exciting murals. Next. Here's a piece of the mural. And what happened is the place where these murals were painted, they were painted on oil on canvas, was destroyed, and all of the murals were thrown in a dumpster. There were 4 murals, and 2 of them were recovered, and the Historical Society took them over. But how easily all of this could have been lost. Next. This guy's a really famous person in the mural, and he has his spyglass under his arm. And again, look at the color. The sea is not just a blah blue, it's got all kinds of blues in it. Next. Another scene. Next. So she was considered one of the foremost female artists, mural artists in Illinois. And I think, you know, as she gets more recognition, I think she will be considered as a great national muralist. Next. Now, there was a house in Chicago area called the Audie Home, and it was a detention center for girls. And she was asked to do murals there, and a lot of other people didn't really think they wanted to work there because there was, you know, there were lots of problems with the young women. But she thought it'd be great because she thought she could brighten these kids' lives. It was important for her to do these murals. Next. So here's a picture of her standing on a ladder, And if you notice, the mural goes from spring to summer to autumn. And again, I love seeing her on a step ladder because it puts into perspective how big these murals were. Next. So here we have that summer feature with, and going into fall. And you see the workhorses and the agricultural feeling of what it might be like to get out of the city of Chicago and out of that detention home and just dream about maybe what life could be like. Next. Young girls playing, just enjoying a beautiful spring day in Illinois. Next. Another thing that happened here, you have a woman who's from one of the most prominent families in Chicago. She's been a debutante. I mean, she's had everything. I guess she's a privileged girl. And the Depression hits, her family loses their fortune. She willingly goes to work. She is all about, I can do this. She's not embarrassed by working for the WPA. She just liked the challenge and she liked working with people. Next. Another mural that she was able to design was in the trustees lounge. Now, the way I found out about this was when the Century of Progress Chicago World's Fair happened in 1933, Sheboygan, Wisconsin, won a trip for about 15 delegates to go to the fair for free and see what it was like. And so this newspaper article where these statements are from talked about the trustees lounge, how beautiful it was. Now the ceiling was done by another female muralist, and Frances was given the job of recreating what it would have looked like at the fair at the turn of the century in the 1890s. So her mural was about the gay 90s, but she was not allowed to paint the murals she designed because she wasn't a member of a union that was only men, muralist artists that were only men. So she designed the artwork, pre-painted the artwork, but was not allowed to draw it at the fair. Well, these Sheboygan people said of all the places they visited during the fair, the trustees lounge was the most elegant and beautifully done. Next. So this is considered one of her most famous works of art. It's called the Celery Pickers. And it looks a lot like a prototype for a mural, but it wasn't. It was an art piece. And one of the things that I think is interesting is she was really prolific in exhibitions. There's not a lot of artwork out there that we can find for sale or that was done by Frances Badger. But she exhibited 17 years of her life. She exhibited at the Art Institute of Chicago. She also exhibited at private art galleries all over Chicago. She was president of the Chicago Art Society. She worked very hard to promote art and her art in Chicago. She did another piece called Celery Pickers #2, which I've never been able to find online, in watercolor later on. Next. Now this one's very disturbing to me. I don't know what happened to the poor guy on the left, but he doesn't seem to have a body connected to his head. But again, the colors and the composition are very different. Next. And then I love her Navajo women. I don't know, it just looks very, she's very respectful of her topic. And again, the colors are phenomenal. Next. Now, Old Superior Street is where she lived. She painted this in 1940, and it's an oil, but again, a very different style than what we've been looking at. And before she went into a nursing home, this is where she lived. Next. And we've got a totally different style. And this particular piece, Toxco, is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. Next. There's those colors, those purples and those blues. Imagine she had to do quite a bit of mixing to get all that detail in the color. Next. Just a simple line drawing of a nude in brown pen and ink. Next. And here, the kitchen. I have no idea where the kitchen was located or why she painted this particular picture. But again, it's an interesting topic. Next. This painting was done on her trip to Europe in 1927. And I think it really depicts the modern, it almost looks architectural, like she's maybe taking time to draw like an architect. Florence. Next. And here we are, Asheville, North Carolina, Asheville Nouveau, 1929. Totally different than what all the other art that we've been looking at. Okay, next. And this was home, ancestors' home in Chicago. And today, I don't know if the Chicago Athletic Club is still on this site, but this is where the Chicago Athletic Club was in later years. And she used this sketch from one of her grandmother's photographs. So her grandmother, the Civil War era lady, got into photography at the end of her life. And so Frances found some of those old photographs and used them in her artwork. Next. Simply the orchestra. Next. The circus. Now there's several parts to this work, and this was sold to a private person in Oak Park. By the way, I don't know if I told you, but the Badger family lived in Kenilworth. Kenilworth, it was a pretty posh suburb in Chicago. I wonder if it still is today. Next. More open scene of the circus. That'd be a great mural too, wouldn't it? Next. Here's the Tree Studio, and it was founded in 1894, and it was supposed to be an incredible art colony. And if you could get a place to paint at the Tree Studio, you were in the right company. Next. Now, another thing she did for years and years and years is she spent her summers with Paul, her son, with Shreve, her son. Paul was her husband, at the Saugatuck Art Colony in Michigan. And she ran the artist store there for years. She managed it. She taught classes there. And I guess maybe that called to her because, again, we're back in nature and we're on water, and I see lots of trees, just like maybe Big Lake reminded her of Big Lake. Okay, next. I love this one too, a rural school scene. Now, one of the places that her murals were at Joliet High School. And I don't know if some of these school pictures were prototypes for the high school there. Next. Here's a picture of her in her 90s. So she was still in the art scene up to when she died at the age of 19, at the age of 93. So there she is. Next. I love this quote. I'm going to read this one because I love to just hear the sound of it. Depicting the beauty and charm of the good earth's living creatures is a defining feature of my artwork. So, at the age of 4, she travels to northern Wisconsin. At the age of 8, she's at the Art Institute of Chicago working, and she's doing all this beautiful artwork all her life. Let me tell you one story about being at the Tamaracks, which I think is interesting. So Alpheus, being a lumber broker, had to have communication with Chicago when he was up north. So he put one of the first telephone lines into the area. And Francis said whenever a thunderstorm would come up, the phone line would carry the electricity from the strikes through the house, and it was terrifying. So one of the kids would always, I don't know why they sent their kids, maybe they're hoping that, but anyways, the kids would have to go and unhook the phone system in the back of the dining cottage where the phone was. And Frances was so terrified of that experience that even when she was home in Kenilworth, she refused to answer the phone through her whole childhood. She said, there's no way I'm getting electrocuted. I'm sorry, I'm not doing it. So think about that. These girls that came up for the camp too, they're coming from the city, they're living the good life. And then they're going back to, by the way, when they came up from Chicago to camp, they rode the Pullmans. They had 3 private Pullman cars for these girls to ride. And one thing that was said one spring was, well, they came a certain weight, and when they left, they weighed themselves and found that good air and eating all that good fish and wild blackberries really made a difference in their size. So anyways, that's kind of my story. And I really enjoyed talking to you about it. I hope there's some questions, and I hope maybe somebody's in the audience that knows more about Frances Badger than I do, so that I can get more information on her. But come to the Kohler Library and see her paintings. They're real treasures. Or go to the St. Charles Public Library and see her originals.
Well, thank you very much, Kay. That was outstanding. And it's really exciting to see how the Northwoods motivated such a notable artist. So I am right now looking at the chat to see if there's any questions. It would also be great if somebody unmuted themselves and just we could take turns asking Kay questions directly if you have any. All righty.
It's your brother, Roger.
Hello, Roger.
Is this why Wisconsin is called the Badger State?
That is right. You know, that whole business about that animal thing that's a mascot, that's not true. It's all about Frances Badger.
That's what I thought.
Okay.
Now I'm muted.
I have. Oh, I'm sorry. Thanks, Roger. Good to hear from you. Ann Brower asked, did her family sell Keego Lodge? Do you know about when?
Her family sold in the 20s or early 30s during the Depression.
Okay, thanks. Here's some more feed. Oh, go on.
Kay, what year did Frances die?
Oh, she was 93. She was born in 1904. So can we do the math, Barb?
Sure.
Can you tell us what the math is? I don't have a pencil here. Can't do it in my head.
1997.
Huh? 1997, did Jim say? Ah, yeah. Not that long ago. If we'd only known, we could have found her and talked to her.
Hello.
Hello.
Sure.
Yeah, hi, I'm Betsy and my family has Keith Island,
Okay.
Big Lake.
Yes, nice. Did you hear I mentioned your family's name?
Yes, I did. Yeah, no, but I was wondering, did they ever figure out how it got Big Lake got the name Big Lake because that there was a map, you had a little blurb somewhere in one of your presentations about there was a map of Big Lake, but it was called J. Cotter Lake.
Oh,
Do you remember?
I'm not aware of that. I was always told that.
It was on a whatever, and it was on the website. It
Okay.
says Histories of Big Lake, and that was one of the things listed. So I don't know. I just wondered, because huh?
I was asking Jim if he could speak to
Yeah,
Cotter.
well, I know the map that you're speaking of, and cartographers took a lot of license to change names and rename things, particularly at the turn of the century. And there's one map that's absolutely notorious for that, and I believe that is the one I think is a 1902 printing.
Okay.
But we see that quite often in the evolution of maps.
Yeah. Okay.
I was under the impression, Beth, that Big Lake was named because of the big open expanse that it has.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. I was just wondering.
You know, and speaking of the Keith family, we believe that Mr. Keith is the person who made Mr. Badger aware of the property for sale because they both were from Kenilworth, and Adelphus' father was a banker in the banking field, and so there's a real connection there, I believe.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That makes sense. I don't know for sure about that, but it makes sense. They were both in Kenilworth. My grandfather, great grandfather, I guess, and his family lived in Kenilworth.
Yeah.
On Prairie Avenue. Yeah.
Mm.